Welcome as we trickle in to day 5 of the Institute for Social Ecology's Summer Intensive from Social Distancing to Social Transformation. I'm Blair Taylor, I'm the ISE Program Director. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces, some new faces. It's been a really fantastic week of transformative education and learning with really just people from all over, from Kenya, India, Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, all across North America, all across Europe, the Caribbean, basically as diverse as it was last year, which, you know, if there was an upside to the pandemic, it's really allowed us to kind of digitally expand our ambit. So it's been really exciting. And we're very excited about the panel today. I'm trying to think if there's any logistical things we need to get through. It is the second to the last day. I'll just put this out now because we'll reiterate it at the end, but today is the last panel of today. And then tomorrow we'll start again at 10 in the morning with ISE board member Phil Kropotkin speaking about the history of anarchism. And then we will have our closing circle at 1:30. So especially those of you that have participated for the whole week, we'd love to have you come share your thoughts on the week, make suggestions, things we could do better, things that were great, things that you liked, and, you know, identify some things that as we move forward, how can we keep in touch? How can we keep building momentum and building movement? So with that, I'm going to hand things over to ISE faculty member Haya Heller, and really looking forward to this panel. Thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you, Blair, and I'm super psyched for this panel. Thank you, Marina Citron, Marcela Oliveira, and Franz O'carroll for joining us. It's a wonderful, exciting topic. I'm so psyched. If you want to know where you are, you've come to a panel called Feminist Movement in Theory and Praxis. And in general, the presenter is going to talk, Marina and Marcela are going to discuss the rise of prefigurative and horizontal societies and movements around the world where female leadership both reflects and emerges from a history of feminist praxis. Franz will explain the basics of social reproduction theory, exploring the implications of social reproduction theory for a feminist and communalist praxis. I'm going to introduce the 3 panelists, and then they're going to each take about 10 to 15 minutes or longer if they so choose. To present a little bit, and then we're going to open up for Q&A, and people can indicate in the chat at that point when they want to make a comment. So let me introduce first our first presenter. Marina Citron is a writer, lawyer, and teacher, organizer, militant, and dreamer. She's the editor of Horizontalism, Voices of Popular Power in Argentina. She holds a PhD in global sociology from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and a JD in International Women's Human Rights from the City University of New York Law School. She's an associate professor of sociology at Binghamton University and a longtime activist. She was deeply involved in organizing global justice and the Occupy movements. Our second presenter will be Marcela Oliveira. She's a water commons organizer based in Cochabamba, Bolivia. Since 2004, she's been developing and consolidating an inter-American citizens network on water justice named Red Vida. She sits on a coordinating committee on the Platform for Public Community Partnerships of the Americas, an organization that promotes exchange of knowledge among water utilities based in solidarity and horizontal cooperation. Since 2019, she's been working as a regional coordinator for the Blue Planet Project. And finally, Franz O'Carroll is a libertarian socialist organizer based in Olympia, Washington. And despite this minimalist bio, I'm certain that we're going to learn a lot more about Franz during their presentation. So I'm going to leave it up to the presenters and to do presentations, and then we'll open it up to comments and questions. So first we have Marina Citron.
Franz, everyone for being here. And I'm really looking forward to a conversation, both, you know, from where everyone is coming from your experiences and your thinking experiences. I think so much of the theory we're talking about is, you know, and so much theory in general actually comes out of our practices, not, you know, big theories in university, you know, whatever, professors, walled. So, okay, I'm gonna do a little bit of background into kind of how and I think Marcela and I have some similar thinking anyway, as far as, you know, what this historical moment is, meaning the last few decades. And then I'd really like us to think together about the role of gender in that. So it's not necessarily about feminist movements, it's about practices that I think they come out of feminism. There's a gender component, and the leadership has been predominantly female. And that's what I want to talk about, even if not saying this is a feminist leadership. And I'd also maybe like us to interrogate why we don't say that. And in fact, myself, I mean, this is my confession too. It's years later participating in these movements. And it wasn't until, it was one of the things Marcela said to me some years ago that I'll say at a certain point, about, you know, leadership and women leadership. And I was kind of like, all of these movements, the practices, like who's organizing the day-to-day on the ground, the organizing, the assemblies, it's women, not exclusively, but mostly. So the time period I'm talking about is thinking, you know, kind of the late 1980s. And I think that's very significant. You know, when we see like 1994, the Zapatistas, you know, coming out to the world. But, you know, it's 1989 when we have the fall of the Berlin Wall, what was the Soviet Union not being the Soviet Union anymore. So an idea of socialism and social change fading very much as far as people's visions of what change could look like. And of course, there were different ideas happening at this time, but that's kind of the main thinking. And then we have the Zapatistas in 1994, inspiring people all over the world. And then linked to that, we have, and I imagine there have been some discussions about the Zapatistas over the last days. And then in 2001, not 2001, sorry, in the late 1990s, partly inspired by the Zapatistas, we have the global justice movement in different places around the world, more kind of US, North America, and Europe calling itself like the direct action movement, but the rise of, say, Via Campesina and these different movements globally that are organizing, not so much directed at their individual nation states, but at reconceptualizing power and seeing a kind of power with one another and power together, and targeting international financial institutions and capitalism more generally, and working together in a particular way. I'm going to talk about the forms of the social relationships and the forms of organizing in a few minutes, but just to go like kind of quickly over what I'm thinking about and talking about these kind of big movements over the last decades. We have in Argentina, 2001, the popular rebellion, kicking out 5 governments, and in their place organizing horizontal assemblies, recuperating workplaces, unemployed taking over land, and reconnecting that relationship to land, indigenous movements getting re-energized, in part related to these movements. This is not just Argentina, but in different parts of Latin America, we were seeing this, especially in the early 2000s. And I know Marcela is going to talk in more detail about Bolivia in the early 2000s. And then many of you maybe were involved in the Occupy movements or the movements of the squares, depending where you are in the world, 2011, 2012, 2013. Continuing, I would say now with the mutual aid networks that we're seeing all over the world in response to COVID, but that we often see in times of disaster and crisis. I mean, all of these things we can talk about in the discussions, where people come together and meet our needs in this horizontal way. So all of these kind of big movements that I just referred to have some core similarities in the way that they're organizing. So it's this, not having the gaze at the state or forming political parties for transformation. So thinking about revolution differently, not like the Soviet Union, and we build the party, we take the state, and then we make the revolution in our day-to-day lives. But instead, this idea of prefiguration. So we're going to create the alternative we desire, we hope for, we would like to see now as much as possible in our relationships. The Wobblies talked about the old and the shell of the new. There are different ways of thinking about this. And that in that, creating these more horizontal relationships. And the language of horizontalism or horizontalidad is, kind of borrowed from the Argentines after the 2001 popular rebellion. And that's what people would say. They would talk about horizontalidad as a description of this relationship that is horizontal, that is looking to one another, that's listening to one another. And that's something, you know, we continue, a lot of us still use that kind of language to think about the kind of relationships we want. So it's not just about not looking to institutions of power like the state for transformation, but that our gaze is horizontal, it is at one another. So the fact that in place after place, the assembly is key. I mean, now in the age of Zoom, this is a fascinating conversation, like how do we make, you know, more democratic and participatory and care-based relationships when we're, you know, mediated through this machine. And we can talk about all of that, but that the core being the building of these relationships with one another, experimenting with different forms of democracy that are not fully representative anyway. There might be spokespeople, there might be different visions of what we see in representation, but it's not representation in the sense of elect someone who will represent you. Honey, you're gonna have to wait. You're gonna have to wait like 5 more minutes. Okay, sweetheart. Thank you.
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, and then I'll help you. This is my bio that you read, Kaya, was very nice, and it was a very, you know, I don't know, more militant academic one. What I say usually now is I'm a mother. Often I'm a single mother at home trying to manage all of this. So I'm going to get interrupted. And I've been taking Camilo with me around the world as we, you know, when there was an around the world traveling happening. And that's just a part of it. That's what it means to, you know, for women to participate in a lot of places. And in the movements that I've participated in and, you know, been exposed to around that I think are the most liberatory and creating these horizontal relationships and these kind of democratic, more directly democratic relationships based in care. In Argentina, they say política afectiva, you know, it's like a care and a love-based and affect-based politics. Children are all around and everybody just kind of helps each other out. It's not, you know, ooh, who remembered to organize the childcare at this conference? Then we put all of our children into one room with walls around it. But it's just a part of it. That's what it means. And most parents, I mean, we all like breaks, but we actually like to have our children near us too. That's part of that vision. And so it is interesting and something I reflected on some, but more recently, I'm starting to reflect on all these pieces where gender comes in and in all of these horizontal movements around the world, or they're striving to be more horizontal. Not all of them. You know, Greece was unique in certain ways. In certain places. I see someone with a Greek name, maybe. So like the amount of smoking, you know, I would have to say, I can't, you know, I'm not going to bring my little nursing baby into this space that's filled with, you know, tobacco. And that was, but generally, having children a part of it is because women have been playing leading roles in so many of these groups and movements around the world. So maybe when we get to the discussion, we can get into a lot more specifics in a lot of these places. But this care-based, more participatory, a politics of listening. I know people were exhausted by the Occupy movement in a lot of ways in a lot of places. It was so much about listening to one another though, and feeling like we were heard. We don't feel heard. We don't feel like we do active listening. And so the People's Microphone in parts of the US was replicated in parts of Europe in places where there was no need for it, where people could have sound systems, not just a megaphone. And they chose to use the people's mic. And I think that's interesting because like having to pause and repeat back what you hear is an exercise in active listening, like wanting to hear one another. And it's something that comes very much out of not necessarily feminist practice, meaning first wave, second wave feminism. So that is a part of it, but I think also it's something women are socialized to do more. You know, we sit and talk to one another. It's why we live longer, actually. It's because we actually talk about our feelings. We're socialized to, it's okay, it's terrible for men, right? You're not socialized to talk about your feelings. And so you hold them inside and you're sick and then, you know, I'm oversimplifying, but all of these things influence the forms of organizing, I believe. And then we see, and I know there were discussions on Rojava earlier in these sessions, you know, very concretely where that's, you know, revolutionary movement and autonomous territory that is putting very concretely into practice this, that women lead and women must lead. And if we don't see it formally, then it can't be. And that's something where a lot of the movements haven't gotten to necessarily. But so, yeah, I guess this is my intervention, is that I think rather than here are all of these feminist movements, it's here are all of these practices around the world, and gender plays a huge role in them. So are they feminist? I don't know how we talk about it, and I'd love to have this conversation here now about that part. I do want to say something Marcela told me, which I quote you all the time, Marcela, in thinking about this. And I remember having a conversation with you so many years ago. I think I was interviewing you on the anniversary of the water wars. And I asked something about women and why we see women are the coordinators of so much of it, but so often then when it's time to do an interview, when there's like the person in front of the video, it's a male face. So what's happening there? Marcela, do you remember this? You were like, oh, well, that's because women like to do and men like to talk. And that's oversimplifying it. It's, we're not trying to be insulting to anyone here. But it just resonated with me in this way. And so I'd like to think about that a lot with these new practices that we're seeing around the globe, new in these last few decades. And I was asked, Blair had asked me to mention Argentina, because there's just been this massive victory for women to control their bodies with abortion rights. And that's huge. And that's been a long struggle. And if you look at how people have been organizing for that to happen, it is consistent with all of this other organizing around the world. It's been assembly-based all over, every part of the country. Women generally, mostly women, coming together, having the discussions, organizing together. The International Women's Day, really taking off again, resurging as a part of the movement, also assembly-based, and then linking to this movement. So that's, I guess, maybe the other piece or the other contribution I'd like to make in this conversation is how we see these different movements as linked to one another, and they're not linear. And it's not that one movement happens and then it fails necessarily, and then we have another. But without the movements of, say, 2001 in Argentina, that were, these assembly-based movements, would the struggle for abortion rights look the way it did? And I don't think it would. And this is also a message to all of us out there who feel like we participate in things sometimes and we feel like they fail and then it's over. And history is just more complicated. And you don't know the effect of your actions in that moment. So the people in the assemblies in Argentina in 2002 and then 2003, and then they start to wane a little bit, feeling like, nothing happened, or women were playing a leadership role and yet, weren't seen as the leaders. We're carrying that history forward and seeing all of it manifest, as a piece of, I think, what we're seeing now around the world. And I had a lot more I was going to say, and there was a potential video short of an assembly I was going to share, but I'm going to stop now and maybe it'll come up in the discussion, but I'd much rather open the space and make it more organic and hear from Marcela.
So welcome, Marcela.
Okay, I have some pictures to show, so I'm not sure how this is going to work, but I'll try. No. I don't think it's gonna work. Anyway, two things.
Marcela, I just made you a co-host, so you should be able to share your screen if that's what you wanted to do.
Yeah. Okay, two things before I start. First, I don't really like to give talks or talk too much. I'm becoming very introverted with the years, and I always said, oh, this is the last one, but then, it was Marina, so I couldn't say no to her. And two, my English is very limited. I don't speak very well English, so I apologize in advance. And I'll talk from my own experience. That's one thing I told Marina at the beginning, that I haven't really theorized about this issue. I know it's important, but I haven't really, my world in the last 20 years, I'll say it has been water. So I really, sometimes you don't have time to think some issues that are important like this one. So anyway, she made me think a little bit on the role of the women in Bolivia. So I'll talk a little bit historically about that. So I'll say that women have been very present in the movements, in the social movements in Bolivia historically, but they haven't, we haven't been really acknowledged on that role. It has been largely ignored by the media, by historians, and I wanted to start my presentation with this picture because that's a monument that it's in the center, practically in the center of the town, and it's doing an homage to Mother's Day. Mother's Day in Bolivia, it's May 27th. It doesn't matter which day of the week it is. It's always 27th of May. I have discussions with my husband about that because he always thinks on Sundays, because I think in the United States it's always Sundays, right? But here it's the day that it comes, it's the day of Mother's Day, and it's May 27th. And it's related to the independence of the struggles for independence in the Andes. That started around 1807. And there's this historical day that is May 27, when all the men went to fight and only women in Cochabamba stayed to take care of the city. Women and children stayed in the city to take care of the city, and all the men went to fight and they were all killed. So women said, okay, men are gone. Nobody's here to defend ourselves, so we're gonna defend ourselves. So they went into this hill, and this monument is exactly on that hill, and it represents the struggle of women and children that went to that hill to die, to defend the city from the Spanish. This is a picture from another angle, and for like my first 15 years, I thought that person in the top, it was a woman, but then they told me that it's Jesus. And I'm not sure what he's doing there, but what it's important is what it's below, right? So, going to another conflict, women also were very important during the Chaco War, which it was a war promoted by transnationals, and it was related to gas in certain areas of Bolivia. Again, men were sent to that war. My grandpa participated in that war. He was sent there, and mainly women stay on the cities, and it was a big, it was the first time in Bolivia where there was this huge incorporation of women to the labor force, because men were fighting and women had to start to work on issues that were traditionally for men, like construction or in the railroads, et cetera, et cetera. So that was another very important moment where women were present, but again, this presence in these moments of need were largely ignored by the media and by people who write the history of our countries. I want to go to a more modern times. This woman who's there, it's the first one that you see on that picture. It's Domitila Tungara. She was a woman who in the mines organized housewives. And they were, along with men, they were fighting for increase on the salaries of men. And years later, this is, I'm talking about around the 60s, but years later, this same woman, along with another 4 other ones, organized a historical hunger strike that made possible the dictator in Bolivia fell down. Nobody believed that could happen. Again, it was only around Christmas. These 5 women started this hunger strike, and in weeks, there were hundreds and thousands in other cities that were accompanying what they were doing, and that made possible that Banzer, the dictator on the 70s, decided then to call for elections. She has a very important book. You can find it in English, and as Marina was mentioning before, the name of the book in English is "Let Me Speak," which again I think it appeals to the need to be heard by others. I want to go to more recent events. One is obviously the water war that Marina mentioned at the beginning, where women were very, very present there. Again, it was not really acknowledged. This is one image that I really like, because this is what you see on that balcony. It's happening at the other side. That's the women there speaking is what it is at the other side of the balcony. So we have been always, I feel like, and that can be reflected on simple images like this one. I have another one that I didn't want to show because it's my brother who is there, who is surrounded by microphones and cameras. And then you see this woman there, just, one reporter from a community media talking to her. Well, all the attention is on the man. So, again, I feel like women have been not necessarily fighting to be acknowledged on this type. So it's not necessarily for women to be acknowledged on these roles. They are there. They are doing what they have to do, what they need to be doing, and I think that's what is needed in the world. Sometimes we don't need that recognition. That's another historical, I'll say, image of the Water War too. And again, women are at the center of the conflicts. After the Water War, there were 2 other big movements in Bolivia. One was related to gas, and the other was related to the defense of the national park where indigenous people live. These are women who started a long march, thousands of miles from one side of the country to the other side, reclaiming to Evo Morales' government another indigenous president, because he wanted to build a highway that will cross their territory. They were violently repressed. This was I guess, the first time in our contemporary history where there was a huge focus on the role of women mobilizing, and as equal and as important as the role of men. So I'm gonna finish with that. Again, I am, this invitation by Marina made me think on the role that we have played, very little known, but I guess also very important, and that nobody really talks about. Yes, so I'm gonna finish there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcela. That was really wonderful. So now I'd like to ask Franz if you would maybe do a little more to introduce yourself, or not, as you like.
Sure. Okay, well, my name is Franz. I live in Olympia, Washington, as was said. I don't know. I mean, I'm not an academic currently. I don't work for a nonprofit. I feel like I don't have much to say about myself. I just do sort of like local community-based, tenant-based organizing work. See if I can get my slide shared here. The presentation I'm going to be doing today is a bit more theoretical than the two we've heard so far, but I think the ideas will mesh really well and synthesize really well. So I'm really excited to see where conversation after this goes. Let's see, I'm trying to get it shared and talk at the same time. Let's see, can people see the slide, the title slide? Okay. Let's see, I was gonna say one more thing about myself. Oh yeah, this is I'm gonna be giving a shortened version of a presentation I gave a couple of years ago at an ISE intensive. I think the last one that happened in person before COVID. So I've been sort of in the Institute for Social Ecology sphere, coming to intensives and stuff for the last couple of years. So shortened version of a presentation I've done before. So I tried to edit it down a little bit. I might run through some things pretty quickly. If I skip over anything people are interested in hearing more about it, bring it up in discussion, and I'm more than happy to keep talking about it. So yeah, what my section of the presentation is going to be is a sort of a really brief introduction to what social reproduction theory is, which just give the briefest of overview here on the title slide. I would say it is a framework broadly within the Marxist tradition, but also sort of a critique and contribution to a Marxian political economy framework that includes an explicitly feminist mode of analysis. So it's an attempt at a feminist political economy that doesn't just sort of tack women on in the end or sort of add a feminist layer like as an afterthought, but sort of really deeply tries to integrate feminist lens into how we understand capitalism as an economy, as a mode of production. And so I think this analysis is really, really compatible with social ecology because both of these frameworks emphasize the importance of organizing outside the workplace, outside of that direct point of production, point of exploitation, and focusing on organizing within communities, public institutions, within households. So, recognizing that social ecology already has this really robust feminist framework within it, but sort of just kind of adding another like economic layer on top of that, because that's kind of my background education-wise. Let's see. Okay, so the full presentation goes through theory, history, and praxis. I'm more or less just going to skip over that history part, outline what social reproduction theory is, what it is as a framework, and then how that can inform how we act, how we oppose capitalism, how we prefigure the new world in the shell of the old. I think that's, I'm glad that Marina, you focused on that, because I think that's really important to what I'm going to be talking about also. Social reproduction theory was broadly sort of started as a movement coming out of like the Italian autonomist movement in the 1970s. There's a handful of feminist theorists at the time, such as Mariosa della Costa and Silvia Federici, who are sort of pioneers in this field. They're known for being active within the wages for housework movement. More recently, this book I have as an image on the screen is a collection of essays that was published in 2017, edited by Tithi Bhattacharya, which is really good and is a main sort of source for a lot of the stuff in this presentation. Let's see. I'm not very good at the presenter mode on this slides app, so I don't know if it's switching when it should, but okay. So first, for understanding what social reproduction theory is, we first have to understand what social reproduction is, what socially reproductive labor is. So broadly, under capitalism, that's understood to be any labor which is necessary for reproducing the working class and reproducing the conditions of capitalism. So creating and reinforcing the social relationships of capitalism, the ideological underpinnings of capitalism, and the physical, biological human beings that participate in capitalism. There's a very loud rainstorm where I am, so I don't know if people are getting that background noise, but it just started pouring. So yeah, in a traditional sort of Marxian political economic view, the primary sector of capitalism that is talked about is the productive sphere. That's the sphere where, typically the, masculinized male worker goes to the factory or whatever workplace and, labors for a wage. But then you have this whole other sphere that is so incredibly necessary to maintaining capitalism, which is the reproductive sphere. So traditionally, we think of that as happening within the household. It's care labor, it's raising children, it's labor that is typically devalued by capitalists. It is usually feminized and racialized in the sense that the expectation is that it's done by women, and very frequently by women of color, in terms of like very low paid domestic labor, and so on. And so by having this analysis of the reproductive sphere as this whole sphere of the economy, it opens up, I think, a deeper understanding of the relationship between exploitation and oppression. We typically talk about exploitation as being, economic in character, typically, affecting people on the basis as class, as workers, and then oppression as something that happens on a cultural or a political or an ideological sphere. But I think recognizing that these two things aren't separatable, they're not independent from each other. The ways in which exploitation is carried out is very much happens along lines of race and gender. And the way that oppression plays out is very much also dependent on, the class position of the people involved. And so, yeah, that's one of the reasons I think this is important. The other reasons being that, this analysis helps to reveal different contradictions within capitalism that we might not otherwise recognize, and helps inform how we resist capitalism, how we overcome it, and what types of alternatives we can build to it. Okay, so on a more concrete level, what is social reproduction? You can broadly sort of categorize it in these three categories. The first being, biological reproduction. I think that one's fairly self-explanatory. The biological process of child rearing, breastfeeding, creating the next generation of human beings, of capitalist subjects. Then you have the reproduction of labor power on the sort of day-to-day basis, which can look like, domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, childcare, which, out of that emerges the sort of generational process of labor reproduction, which is, the whole, from birth to death process of child raising, ideological education, enforcing and reconstituting existing social relations, shaping children into, the laborers that they will become. And then once people sort of age out of, the productive sphere of being a worker, caring for the elderly. So that's what those three different sort of type levels of social reproduction, and how they all, you can kind of see them all as part of the same general process. And then this process of reproduction can take place sort of organized in different ways, or in different physical locations. So we can think about social reproduction happening within the household, within the family, traditionally the hetero patriarchal nuclear family, but in any sort of family situation. What this is, reproduction is sort of individualized to these, atomized separate households, which, form under capitalism sort of basis of this reproductive system. The home is a site in which, reproductive labor is unwaged. Traditionally, that, would be supported by, maybe a male wage earner bringing home enough money to, pay for you know, all the food for his wife and kids, but the wife is at home, you know, preparing the meals and whatnot. And, you know, obviously households, families exist in lots of different ways, but that's like the traditional way that I think capitalism evolved to expect that sort of formation. And then we see the next way that we see social reproduction happening is maybe through state institutions. So we can talk about that in terms of public schooling, public, you know, healthcare in countries where that exists. I am unfortunately American, so I wouldn't know about that. But also, you know, parks and community-based like leisure facilities, pensions, you know, any sort of like social welfare where the state is in some way either paying for or directly providing social reproduction. Then you see spheres where productive activity sort of intersects with reproductive activity. So, you know, you could think public schools or the prison system or any of these places where people show up to earn a wage, but are still, you know, participating in this process of molding people as ideological subjects and on some level providing shelter, food, medical attention, and so on. And then finally, we can talk about social reproduction happening in communal institutions, which is where we can start having conversations about prefiguration and what it would look like to build new institutions, create new communal, participatory, democratic institutions where we're able to meet our own needs, meet other members of our community's needs, you know, raise children, create new, you know, or yeah, do a different kind of ideological education than, you know, capitalist ideological education. And, you know, essentially create new spheres, new places where this type of labor can happen and where we can reimagine what reproductive labor might look like outside the confines of capitalism, outside the confines of having to, you know, create and maintain a wage labor force. Let's see, I'm gonna skip through most of this history, but then I did want to talk about, sorry, gotta drink my water. Yeah, so this, like, I guess most recent era of capitalism that we are arguably currently in called neoliberalism, which I would, you know, define around increased financialization, privatization, a shift, you know, in the US and the first world away from production towards a more like service-based economy, a lack of power and, you know, organized labor, you know, and so on. But I bring this up because, you know, in this era, we have seen, like, I think a heightening, you know, over the last like 50 years, essentially half a century is really like the span of neoliberalism. But over the course of this time, seeing, you know, a heightened crisis of reproduction that, you know, looks like, you know, a decline in the welfare state, you know, coinciding with women, you know, on a larger scale than before entering the labor market, having less, you know, time, less resources to actually, like, you know, provide for their children, care for their children, participate in, you know, necessary reproductive labor. At this, you know, during the same time period, a generalized decrease in social services, decline in real wages, decrease in standard of living. More and more, it's, you know, the norm for families to be based around 2 adult income earners or 1 adult income earner and no dedicated like child raising role, which, you know, simultaneously provides more freedom to women to not be dependent on a male wage earner, but also, you know, continues this process of deprioritizing and devaluing reproductive labor. Let's see. So yeah, so all of this leads to a crisis of reproduction, you know, at its root, the cause being, you know, capitalism, this centuries-long project of the devaluation of reproductive labor, of what is seen as women's labor, increased privatization, and, you know, on a practical level, this can look like increasing rents, gentrification, you know, contaminated water, or, you know, in general, the services, the necessities of life that we expect either the government to provide, or, you know, oftentimes, you know, a lot of municipalities, these utilities are privatized, but these things that we expect to be available, you know, being contaminated or not being healthy or not being safe, available, or affordable. This can look like, you know, increased prison population, you know, because we have this whole population of people that are unable to meet their own needs, unable to, you know, participate in this like self-reproduction or communal reproduction, and end up, you know, being criminalized, removed from society, and essentially having their reproduction as a person sponsored by the state in terms of, you know, having food, again, shelter, provided for them, but at the expense of, you know, their freedom, their ability to self-actualize, their ability to form meaningful social relationships, and so on. So I think that leads me into the last section I want to talk about is, what does all of this mean for what we should be doing, what we should be thinking about when we're developing our strategies towards creating a better world? So one of the essays in that book I mentioned at the top of my presentation, the collection of essays on social reproduction theory, is one of my favorite essays, is called Without Reserves. It's by Mohandesi and Titleman, and they essentially outline what they think the three possible responses are to this heightening crisis of social reproduction that we're experiencing within modern capitalism. And, you know, obviously I'm biased towards one of these over the other two, and feel like other people probably are as well, but they essentially think that either this crisis could be resolved by a return to, or the creation of a new like social democratic formation, a revitalization of the welfare state, you know, increased social welfare, increased funding towards things like childcare, and, you know, etc. The next one is like a return of right-wing populism, which can in some ways overlap with this social democratic vision, but with more emphasis on returning to an idealized past. It's very much predicated on a white supremacist view of the nation, you know, within the context of the US at least, and relies on the re-subjugation, the continued subjugation of women and children within like a heterosexual, patriarchal, nuclear family. And then finally, we have, you know, imagining this completely new alternative that exists outside of capitalism as a response to capitalism, which would be, you know, the creation of autonomous initiatives aiming to rebuild a more communal life. And so this, you know, is something that obviously requires deep structural transformation. It can start on, you know, the very basic level of creating small community-based mutual aid projects, and, you know, hopefully prefigure something much bigger, much deeper. And so I think what that would mean, what that would require, is recentering, or centering, maybe for the first time, this idea of reproduction, of social reproduction, both in our movements and in the vision of the world we want to create. Part of this would look like, you know, reharmonizing this relationship between the economy and the public sphere. Like right now under capitalism, the economy is controlled by a very small handful of individuals who, you know, are at the top of the very small number of very powerful capitalist firms. And they're the ones that are broadly setting economic policy, making economic decisions. But if these economic decisions about production and distribution of, you know, goods and services and resources was decided communally, democratically, you know, within a community assembly structure, done at the community level and able to be federated upwards to include, whole regions, then, you're putting the decision-making power in the lives of everyday people, of people who are participating in this process of social reproduction, who are being reproduced themselves. And in that way, we can reorient our priorities. So rather than reproduction solely existing to be instrumentalized towards production, to be instrumentalized towards maximizing the profits of capitalists, we can kind of flip that around and say, okay, when we are talking about production, what needs to be produced, what not commodities, but what goods need to be created to meet our needs and desires, that should be towards the ends of maximizing our social reproduction, our social lives, our the uniquely human and social and communal aspects of who we are. And then the second point on this slide is moving beyond the individual, beyond the family. Let's see, where's my point about that? Oh yeah, so yeah, right now reproduction is very much, privatized, atomized, individualized within these private household spheres. And being able to bring that back out into the community and making it a communal participatory process in order to revitalize community life, public life, transcending, private insular family life by, offering avenues for community participation and, self-actualization, community actualization. Finally, moving past a rigid, workplace focused leftist politics, which is, very much comes out of 20th century and earlier, and specifically sort of Marxist frameworks tend to focus, or, even, early anarchist frameworks focus primarily on organizing within the workplace, but being able to move past that and say, we don't want to continue to reinforce this dichotomy between the productive sphere and the devalued, delegitimized, feminized reproductive sphere. So instead of focusing purely on workplace democracy or workplace organizing, we can talk about organizing people of every gender, sexuality, every race who participate in any kind of labor, organizing them on the community level, within popular assemblies, and creating democratic participation that way. That doesn't mean we have to ignore the workplace. That's not what I'm advocating for by any means, but just not making it the only place of struggle. So this is my last slide. Just a few even more practical, concrete things I think this might look like. Tenants organizing for the rights of tenants or the decommodification of housing, struggles over education and childcare. That could look like teachers organizing in a union. It could look like students organizing and advocating for themselves over what the curriculum is. It could be parents advocating for universal pre-K or education. Anti-police prison community defense, as I mentioned just briefly. I see prisons as, at least in part, being a part of this crisis of reproduction, and be able to keep our communities safe from the most armed and violent wings of the state is super crucial. Building community municipal infrastructure, communal institutions, that can look like mutual aid networks, hopefully, be able to build and grow past there, and, eventually seeking to oppose state power by reopening public space, creating institutions that give people power directly and help grow the consciousness of people in order to, create a new society in the shell of the old, create a new economy that values reproductive labor, values our worth as human beings and our potential to, self-actualize past the very individualistic way that is understood under capitalism. So yeah, that is all I have to say. I hope I didn't go too far over time. I was trying to condense this down, but I did my best.
Great. Thank you so much, the three of you. Those were really excellent kind of doorways to now open up further, to invite folks in to ask questions or make comments. One thing that I think works really well is that you can post your name in the chat, and if you could put a couple asterisks by your name that I can see, and I can create a stack. And when you're making a comment or a question, just to kind of keep things moving, if we could keep your comments or questions a little bit short, and instead of piggybacking two together or three, just really have one. And then if your name comes up again, you can ask another question at a different time, just to keep things moving. So write down, if you just say your name, and I will type your name with an asterisk, and I'd be happy to call on you for a question or comment. Don't be shy. Okay, while people are warming up, I have a comment. I have a comment. I mean, so much of what these three presentations share is this theme of social reproduction, of this kind of work that comes out of the sexual division of labor that seems to be somewhat global, somewhat time is, it dates back to Neolithic. It's a really interesting anthropological kind of formation, the sexual division of labor. And so that people who are either born as women or identify as women are kind of tasked with this kind of work that people do. And in the 80s, the primary way people started trying to talk about this was by using the term ecofeminism. I was really part of that scene in the 80s and 90s, and then that scene sort of shifted. And I would love to ask the three of you to comment on, in what ways does this relate to kind of an ecofeminist conversation? And then I'll just add one more piece, and not piggybacking, it's the same question. That one of the challenges for ecofeminism has been and will always be that many people who do this work don't identify as feminist. That's a very specific, often Western concept. And in the United States, a lot of folks who do this kind of frontline community organizing work, who have to be female, don't identify as feminist. So if you could speak to the feminist thing and to how you relate or don't relate to the ecofeminist legacy, that would be awesome. And I'll take stack.
I mean, maybe everybody in this space is familiar, but if you would, that would be great.
I guess I don't have a super well articulated answer, but my first thoughts are just that, like, I think the ways in which, like, feminized labor, socially reproductive labor gets devalued and made cheap as a way to, support and maintain the system of capitalism is pretty similar to the process by which, like, our natural environment gets made artificially cheap, turns into this resource for, like, direct expropriation to the benefit of capitalist profit. So I think, a similar framework of analysis can be used to say, in order to move past capitalism, in order to create something better, we can't just focus on, maintaining this same framework of productive industry, but make it, worker owned or worker controlled. We really have to, like, move past this paradigm of, like, production for the sake of production for the sake of profit, that, instrumentalizes women's labor, instrumentalizes, the natural environment as, purely resource for extraction. So I see those two things as very, very related. And yeah, that's all I have to say about that, I guess. Oh, and I guess the feminism question. I mean, like, I feel like I'm very young, I haven't been around, like, in feminist movements for very long. Like, in my politicization, I've never really been part of any movements that are like explicitly feminist. It's more of like trying to bring a feminist lens, a feminist analysis to movements that are more universalist in nature. And so yeah, that I guess that's been my emphasis, my focus personally, but I don't know how that fits into other people's experiences.
Okay. Does anybody else on the panel want to speak to the feminist, not feminist, or how do you relate to ecofeminism question?
Seems to have a delayed reaction. Can you hear me now? Yeah, I was actually just going to ask you, because Haya, you are part of all of that. I mean, I learned about it a bit, but I'm wondering if you could just say a few words about ecofeminism, actually. And I mean, I would rather you speak to it a little bit, especially for people who maybe don't have a background. And then, I mean, for me, as to feminism generally, yes, if it's when it's, you know, broad and inclusive and kind of like, you know, a lot of different movements. I mean, so yes, I identify as a feminist, and some people, you know, and what that means to me, that, you know, I identify with the history of women who have organized and self-organized for our liberation and our collective liberation. I think too often, and this is actually a problem with the academic world, so I'd love it if you would speak a little to ecofeminism, because it seems to have escaped some of getting too boxed in, like feminism has. It kind of, you know, is this movement, like so many things, you know, we have these amazing movements, and the theory is produced by regular people, by us, in movement, and then it gets kind of captured and then theorized and also made usually semi or totally inaccessible in the language, and then it becomes like the territory of another sphere, which is the more like academic, and people make their livings on this NGO academic world. And I feel like that did in the US and kind of Western feminism to different extents that happened. And so, you know, but if by feminism we mean women, we mean what, you know, they're doing in Rojava, then absolutely. So I guess that's where it gets, I'm not trying to be anti, you know, theory, but.
No, not at all. I'm wondering, Marcela, would you like to speak to that, to the, how do people within the movements you've been part of relate to the feminism concept, and does ecofeminism ever come up in those contexts, in those conversations?
I think it's Silvia Federici, the one that said that it's very important to name those things, to, you know, to actively find a language on that. But I don't think that should be a limitation also. We wouldn't, you know, if we're talking in movements here in Bolivia, which I believe they are very, they are doing a lot of things, not necessarily use that type of language, which I think it's good, and it could be also a weakness. But in the last years, I will say the last decade, yes, young people are starting to use more of those terms, but that's not really something that traditionally has been coming on, you know, on indigenous groups, for example. Again, it's a language pretty much from abroad that it's coming. But again, you know, I feel like it's important to start to name things and find a vocabulary and a language that appeal to us, you know. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm trying to see, am I just not seeing any comments, or are there not any posted there? If there are not, I can briefly, I can say something brief about ecofeminism, which is like a joke because it's so broad and vast, and people were struggling to define it when the 80s and 90s and into the present. So it's kind of funny to try to define what it is. Basically, how I understand ecofeminism, it was a kind of linguistic intervention. I think that feminists or women who were involved in the peace movement in the early 80s, the anti-nuclear movements, women who literally did not have a voice, didn't have a platform, you know, did a lot of the things that you're describing, that they're doing all the work on the ground. But when it comes to the interviews, it's guys who are kind of taking center stage. And I think that ecofeminism literally created a platform for people, women and people identified at birth as women to speak and to have, to be seen as having a perspective that was worthy of being articulated and being able to publish and write and present. And, for me as a young woman in the 80s, I was in my 20s, it was this marvelous event to see this emerging movement that started mostly in the United States, and it went kind of to Europe, and then it kind of started to hook up with these other kind of movements like we see in the Bolivian water war, where we started to see people who were coming from more Western situations who are identifying with the feminist first wave, second wave, ecofeminist sort of trajectories, and sometimes, clashing a little bit with folks who were women who had leadership roles in these movements, but were not interested or even relating to seeing themselves as feminists. But just quickly, the ecofeminist movement, it kind of started again around peace and anti-nuclear, and then it kind of went everywhere. Vandana Shiva became involved in the 80s, bringing in indigenous women in India around the Chipko movement. So it really kind of moved into this sort of global international feminism that looks very much at this social reproductive dimension of labor, this kind of sexual division of labor, where women are doing all of the food production and all of the, the healthcare in the home and the subsistence, agriculture and the agricultural labor. Women are doing all this stuff and getting the water for their families, and again having no presence and not being heard. And again, ecofeminism in my mind was really this intervention that carved out a space of legitimacy and validity that gave a platform. Vandana Shiva created a huge platform for a lot of different kinds of women to come into the conversation who otherwise would not have been joined in the conversation and would have been kind of edged out. And that's kind of the broadest brush I can give to, what ecofeminism is or was. But again, I'm fascinated to still think about how people do or don't relate to ecofeminism or feminism as they're doing this kind of work. I'm gonna look back in the chat and see if anybody's.
At first stack, I think there was Toby had a question for Marina asking if you could expand a bit on the assemblies you mentioned, and then I saw Alex, then Dee, then Jenica, then Laura on stack in that order.
Okay, that stack happened while I was running my mouth.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the first was the question for Marina.
Yeah.
I mean, I can talk about assemblies. I'm very happy to do that, forever. But if other people, I mean, should we maybe take one or two comments, questions if other people want to talk about assemblies as well and their comments? I imagine a lot of you have participated in a lot of them. So, so can I wait?
Sure. Sure.
I guess that would make Alex next, unless anyone wanted to jump on to make a specific comment about assemblies.
All right, well, the question that I have is sort of, I was wondering if, so Franz's presentation, which was great, was it maybe a bit more theoretical? And I was wondering if Marina or Marcela had some thoughts about sort of the role of social reproduction within movements and what that looks like. And then of course, Franz can, and I'm sure Franz has experience to talk about that in a more concrete way as well. So that's my question, just like comments on how you see social reproduction in movements.
Do all three of you want to take a stab at that?
I can say something about my own experience on that. I think from the individual, from your household, when we're talking about social reproduction, it goes when there are these big movements, at least during what the time that happened to us, they go to broader spaces. For example, I remember during the water war, there was this division of labor where women will stay on the blockades and will do these common pots where they will cook for, for the children or the other women that were there. Something similar happened during the pandemic here. There was a big movement made by young women mainly, and it was called Olla Común, which is a common pot. And they'll go to neighborhoods where there weren't, people couldn't have food or couldn't access to food, and will take, stuff there. So I think what we are doing in our houses is something that, when there are these moments in mobilizations where, we can take that stuff, we can amplify the work that we do at home, and we do it in a more broader way. One thing also that was very interesting during the water war is that women will mainly stay, the women that stay at the blockades will make sure that men won't drink, for example. The few men that were there won't drink. So it was kind of a social control to make sure that they won't, once they are, because there's nothing else to do in a blockade other than once you have put the stones and the, other things there, there's nothing else to do. So what usually men do is they drink. So women will be there to control, they don't do that, and they don't do stupid things once they are drunk. So, I feel like there is those things that little things that we do at home, then it's something that we take to these other spaces, and we do it for the common well-being. That's, those are little examples that I can say of, what my experience here.
Thank you.
That's consistent too with the pandemic. And I was looking around for it. I co-edited a book with it. We ended up becoming a collective, Colectiva Sembrar, and it's called Pandemic Solidarity. I don't know if someone could grab it and stick it in the link from Pluto. It came out last summer. We turned it around really, really fast. And it's almost all women who edited each of the different sections from around the world. So there's sections from Rojava, from India, from Argentina, from Turtle Island, so kind of the continental, what is the continental US, all over. And it was almost all women doing the interviewing. And so we chose to become a collective as the process, because we were recognizing that our process was collective. But the people that were being interviewed all over the world, thank you for putting that link in. The people who were being interviewed all over the world, we were discovering as we went that it was women, and that the people who were facilitating so much of this mutual aid work, whether it was called mutual aid or not, but definitely, not solidarity. I think most of you here have had it, have experience in self-organizing around the time of the pandemic, and that the work was mostly women doing it, the cooking, but not just the cooking. It's about the building of the relationships. It's remembering that loneliness is huge and making sure to reach out to people. So there are places in Turkey where, these different assemblies and networks that organized to telephone people, not internet, older people who you have to go to their house and knock on the door and then call them on a telephone or try and speak from a distance. So they just see, a human. And so that was very much gendered work, related social reproduction. But if all of us think about different groups you've been a part of or movements, the work of cleaning up afterward, the cooking, like these things that we see visibly, but then also, and this is kind of getting to the whole idea of assemblies as well. So an assembly where people come together and, you assemble. We come together in groups and we have these democratic participatory discussions. And these have, take different forms, but are happening all over the world and have been happening, small, massive, but how they're facilitated. So taking of the stack, is there an order to who does this? Learning to facilitate a meaning. From my experience all around the world, it's generally women who are doing the background organizing of all of that. and the workshops to teach people how to facilitate. That doesn't mean it's the women who are doing the actual facilitating always. And this gets to the spokesperson thing. And that's not just because, you know, men want to jump to the front. That's also because we're socialized to just like, okay, no, you go ahead. You go ahead. You want to go, you go. And we don't step forward and we don't push each other enough, I think, to step forward as part of that. But I see it everywhere in all of our organizing spaces. So it's, you can both be, you know, having women leading and have this social reproduction and having it all, you know, have it be women of color who are doing all of that work at the same time. Just because they're kind of women playing a leadership role doesn't mean it's all good now. Like that's not, it's really complicated. It's more kind of, and if you look at the movements, that's who's doing so much of the work, the day-to-day work in it, yeah.
Franz, did you want to respond or should we take Dee's question?
I'll respond really quickly. I think Marcela and Marina said most of what I wanted to say, which is great. But I think, yeah, when we're thinking about the relationship of like social reproduction to organizing, there's sort of two levels to it. It's the first being like making sure that like people's need to participate in socially reproductive labor isn't inhibiting their ability to participate in organization. So if someone's like the primary caregiver, the mother, whatever, to a child, and you know there's no childcare at the meeting, then that's a problem, right? If someone doesn't have enough time to make food for themselves and their family and they can't show up to a meeting, like that's a barrier, right? So addressing those barriers. And then exactly what Marina was just talking about, I'm really glad you mentioned this, of like the reproductive labor of reproducing an organization or a movement, the sort of like background work that isn't as exciting, isn't as masculinized, isn't as desirable sometimes, like, you know, showing, like calling people up and reminding them that the meeting is happening, or maintaining the email list, or whatever sort of like unglamorous work. Like again and again, I also notice this falling upon women more often. And so even just recognizing those patterns, you know, teaching more people how to do that, making sure that that type of labor is actually valued within social movements, you know, I think all of that is really important.
Thank you. Dee, would you like to put out your comment or question?
Hey y'all, my name is Dee. I use they them pronouns. I'm living in Southern Appalachia in occupied Salagi land. Well, I was thinking about this question and y'all actually gave some like tangible examples of the question I was going to ask, but I could still ask the question because maybe interested in like the theory a little bit too. The question is not necessarily for Franz, but is in relationship to like reproductive labor theory. So sometimes when I think about like, well, Franz, you mentioned like kind of since the second wave demands about how we conceptualize feminized labor, that like in Europe, the way the social safety net expanded to like meet those demands in some ways is really interesting. And sometimes I think about in the United States how there's been like a really large expansion of the market to do the same thing. In some, I'm not saying in a positive sense, but like for instance, like the way there's been like a really large expansion of like food preparation and child raising and various kinds of care work and online sex work, these kind of like really kind of undervalued, low paid kind of care work, like has seen a massive expansion in the last 30 years, at least in the United States. And I guess my question in thinking about this, my question is, I guess looking for like strategic advice about how do we deepen the social value of reproductive labor without allowing it to be incorporated into the market. The same way in Europe, they like wanted to deepen the value, but it got incorporated or is increasingly incorporated into the state. And like, I know part of it's like how we communalize reproductive labor, but I guess I'm interested in like, yeah, what y'all think about that.
Who'd like to go first?
I guess I can go first. Yeah, I mean, my thoughts on that are essentially that, you know, throughout the history of capitalism, there's been different ways of organizing social reproductive labor. Like there hasn't been like one consistent like regime or one consistent static social relationship. It's obviously varied throughout time, throughout different geographies, and so on. But I think, you know, in this sort of era of global neoliberalism, where you see this huge shift everywhere, pushing towards more and more privatization, towards social reproduction happening through the market, like I think there's a tendency of some, you know, more liberal feminists or people who don't have a critique of capitalism saying like, oh, this is, you know, this is how we value this labor, is by paying people for it. And so recognizing that, you know, wage labor, we're never going to be liberated by wage labor. And then there's another framework, you know, maybe a more social democratic or reformist framework that says, oh, we just need to return, like we need to create a stronger state, a stronger welfare state. You know, it's the government's responsibility to like make sure all these needs are met. And I think we just really need to focus on, you know, moving forward into solutions that are neither state-based nor market-based, that really do start on the community level, the neighborhood level, are, you know, directly democratic and participatory, you know, all these things. We can't expect either the state or the market to do this work for us because of how human it is, you know, and we can't, you know, some people want to like automate socially reproductive labor, and it's like, you know, like you're gonna raise a baby with a robot. I don't know. Like it's just so human, it's so personal. Like this kind of stuff has to be organized on that very human level. So in whatever way that informs what our praxis is, I think that's really important.
Just to kind of chime in on two levels. One, just the like there's the like our movement or activist spaces is one thing. And that I think is about changing the culture. I mean, yes, about childcare, but it's about changing our culture. Like you know, my child is really thrilled because right now, you know, it's all about the like animal game on the iPad. But I said, like, you can come in here, you can be here. It's going to be disruptive, and it's changing the culture, like what we get accustomed to. Marcela and I were at an event. I remember when Camila was there, and a friend of mine, if this was in New York City, and a good friend of mine who I hadn't seen in a while came to the discussion, and we rode the subway home. And he's like radical for years, right? He was part of the like Autonomen in Germany. He's a US person, but anyway, he was critical because he thought it was really disruptive that I was letting Camilo run around. I nursed him like twice in the meeting while I was giving the presentation, right? So, you know, I was pushing some boundaries, maybe with some people, but that's got to be okay. And it's, you know, and it's sometimes hard to hear, and people find that difficult, and we have to shift that culture. So that's in like the political movement spaces. And Marcela, who's like there to also, you know, participate in the discussion, is one of the only people who steps forward and starts playing with Camilo and taking him for a walk, which was also like, you know, we have this like territorial idea about children and like, can I go near your child? So that's one thing. So the activist space, like that's got to shift, and we have to shift that culturally. But I mean, and I'm not about let's make demands on the state as our point of reference, but at the same time, here, like where I live, you know, I have neighbors on both sides, and they have children. And we really do take care of each other's children. Like if I have something to do early in the morning, I can bring Camilo and they will bring him to school or watch him. I watched my neighbors' children because they needed to have an important, you know, adult conversation alone and aren't in a situation to have a babysitter. And even if they were, like, why would they? Because, so thinking about those relationships that we already have, and when they go on for periods of time, they should be, you know, should I then maybe work 3/4 time, not full time? Or, you know, how is that there is, in the capitalist economy we live under, there is something to putting a value on that labor also, so that we can do it and we can do everything fairly. So I think there's, you know, what we're doing, and then shifting the kind of, you know, what we get for that, and shifting our culture. Marcela, I don't know if you want to go on this one too, or no, we'll go to the next. And I sent this link, it's in Spanish, but about an assembly in Argentina. You know, actually, maybe I could just,
at 6:30.
can I said 6:45, sweetheart, you know, I'm sorry. I have to go at 6:45. I don't know why. I committed to do this at 7, and I start bedtime routine at 7, and I am pretty like, you know, you can bring your child to assemblies, but bedtime is bedtime. I don't know if I should share screen just for like a minute or two for the person who asked the question about assemblies. Can I let's see if I can, because this assembly, and this is a few years ago in Argentina, but to give a flavor of like in the building for, it's about abortion rights, but it's also about like, you know, International Women's Day. And this assembly in particular is an argument around Afro-Argentines, which are kind of, people have this idea of Argentina and they see Buenos Aires and they think kind of light skin, and they don't think, you know, the Mapuche history, the Guarani history, the current history, you know, it's kind of, there's a certain image. Anyway, so this is one of the many assemblies, but it gives you a flavor of what an assembly looks like if you haven't participated in a large assembly. Let's see, I have to share screen and then sorry, I'm technologically just limited. Okay. So I just click share screen, right? Now you go here. Sorry, I talk myself through these things, because, okay, just to click.
El INDEC, básicamente, la mayor cantidad de afrodescendientes son afroargentinos, por lo cual las que más padecen son las afroargentinas. Y aunque yo soy migrante, a través de mí me pronuncio por ella, y porque el acto final que se va a hacer, el comunicado, el documento, se hable también de que en un momento de crisis, las que estamos en el trabajo informal, prácticamente estamos más allá de la línea de pobreza y somos las mujeres afro. Y el segundo, negras y las mujeres indígenas. Esto lo tenemos que tener presente, por favor, porque además siempre estuvimos en el movimiento feminista. Yo soy una histórica mujer.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. How do I do that now? Sorry. Did I stop sharing already, or am I still?
It never came, Marina.
Yeah.
But I could understand everything. I didn't need to see it, but I could understand. I don't know about the rest.
Just me, so I didn't say anything.
So sorry, I couldn't tell. Oh well. Okay. Anyway, the point was more, so you see a large group of people in a circle, someone is speaking, then someone else speaks. There's a moment where someone's like looking for a word, people kind of shout it out. So it's a cultural way of having a conversation as well. That's about that kind of participation. I don't know if that's what the question was a while ago about assembly. But anyway, I know there are more people on the stack, and I do have to leave in 10 minutes.
So Jessica, you were next on the stack. Are you still with us?
Hi, I think I'm Jenica. Hi y'all. I'm in Portland, Oregon. I feel like I put the asterisk in the stack a long time ago, and there's just been like so much that's been talked about since then that I would love to comment on. But I guess I feel like it's been like thank you to all three of the presenters. Thank you so much. I feel like it's been like well established like in this talk that women have had such a central role in their own movements for liberation, as well as in environmental movements and whatnot. I guess I just like want to try to like bridge the like gap between like the theoretical side and then also like the activism side, like, and talk about like why I think it is that women do have such a stake in fighting the building of the pipeline through Minnesota and the Canada pipeline, or fighting against the privatization of water in Cochabamba, and is like the subjugation of women. It has been like historically tied together with the institution of private property. So like for me, like to be a feminist or to be an eco-feminist, which I'm admittedly not very well versed in the history of eco-feminism, but I think it's something that I vibe with. But to me, that means like fundamentally challenging the institution of private property And that is essentially what these movements are doing, when they stand up to prevent a pipeline from being built, or, a new coal mine or whatnot, And, I think like this ties into if people were in Brian Togar's talk this morning, we saw on all 5 continents, there's women participating in these fights against the extractive industries. And then, so yeah, I guess too, like, I like the framing of extractivism to talk about not just like the exploitation of labor, which can be, this comes from Marx and can be like kind of exclusive to the labor realm. But so like extractivism, I feel like, it kind of broadens that, and you're able to like talk about the extraction of, like what the capitalist system frames as natural resources, as well as the extraction of human labor. So yeah, I think I'm kind of, I guess too, yeah, like thinking like how women challenge these, like the capitalist system, like in activist circles and in movement work too, like I think has to be challenging, like, the ideology, the capitalist ideology and of neoliberalism, challenging individualism and like professionalism and elitism kind of thing, like, yes, like if like people have families, it's like, let's bring our kids around, like this is what life is, it's like, so like just like making space for like people to just like be people and like be their full selves, like, and have their kids at work and whatnot, like I think is like something that women like consistently do, as well as like was previously discussed, like opening up the floor for like conversation, like in a way that feels not like competitive but inclusive. I think that is another way that like in my point of view, from my experience, like women have really challenged the ideology of the capitalist system. Okay, I'm gonna end there. Thank you.
Do any of the 3 panelists want to respond to Jenica's comments, or should we move on?
I agree with everything you said. No additions.
Okay, so Laura, you're up next.
Hi, I'm Laura, in Connecticut on occupied Wangunk land. I have a question for Marcela. So I am very interested to hear if you can speak a little bit about what the situation actually was like under Evo Morales, because we heard a lot of things about him being really almost like very eco-socialist, coming more from an indigenous framework, style of governance. And I heard that he was very trans positive, that he put in legislation for trans people to be able to actually change their gender on their birth certificate. We heard, environmental policies. We heard that he, had like I think it was like Mother Earth Bill of Rights or something. So we were hearing all of these things. And then we also heard that, when the coup was, because I heard that it was because he was saying any corporation who wanted to extrapolate lithium from Bolivia had to share the profits with the Bolivian population. And so the multinational corporations didn't like that, and that's what was behind the coup. So I'm hearing all of that, but then I've heard some contradictory things about that as well. And I did, of course, notice in your talk, the issue of him trying to put that highway through Bolivia and the women protesting and everything. And obviously, if they were going to be walking across the entire country, what he was planning on doing was pretty bad. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on what he really has been like as a leader, and whether that's propaganda, what we've been hearing, or whether there were some positive sides to his leadership, or what you think about that.
I'm sorry that this doesn't go really with the issue that we're talking here. But yeah, I think we should trust more people than people in power. And I know that there are, you know, perhaps some of you won't like what I'm saying, but yeah, there was during that the last revolt. I refuse to call it a coup still, because it was a little bit more complex than that. During the last revolt, there were a lot of what I call gringo explaining, because people from abroad were telling us what was going on in our country. And it's like, wait, we are not even understanding what's going on to us, and you are already explaining me what's happening here. So I think we should be a little bit careful with this. I know that there are a lot of academics with good intentions in the United States, but they are, I feel like people on the left don't want to hear criticism. And I think it's important to hear that, there are contradictions in the countries. It's not everything, well or good, and there are always problems. And when it's about that, we really have to hear people, not the ones that are holding power, I feel. So yes, he did some good things, but others were just a very, it's very confusing, because he had this very progressive speech, but what was going on in the real life, in the ground, was a little bit different from the speech. And sometimes people want to, just hear the speeches and build illusions from that. He was very sexist, actually. He will, when he was trying to build this highway, but he said in a speech to the men in the Chapare region where he comes from, he said, go and conquer women and make them say yes to the highway. And everybody laughed about that. And this was on the press, but nobody really, dig more into what it means that. And then I think Mujeres Creando, then later they came with this graffiti that said women are not territory of conquest or something like that. So it's, yeah, there were good things, but there were others that were bad. And, anybody that wants to stay in power forever, in that type of power, in the state, I think it's not okay. And the revolt in Bolivia came basically because he wanted to stay longer there when there was a referendum that said, no, you cannot stay that long. And, it's complex and it's confusing, and, it's very hard for us to talk about this, because then we're tagged as right wings or other even more awful things they said about, but it's just that, that we really have to understand that it was a very complex situation in Bolivia at that time. It's still complex, and these things change, move. It's not, we don't have to see history as something static, but things change over time, and the way that we see things are different from one day or another. I'm sorry, this didn't have anything to do with what we're talking, but I also wanted to highlight these very sexist comments that he said many, many, many times. And I think it's important for us as women, as men that are rethinking these issues about feminism and all of that, to really also pay attention to this type of speech that come from, the leaders' mouths.
Thank you. Next we have Ashley. I don't know if you wanted to make a comment, but you wrote something that
I'm going to have to go in a minute. I'm sorry. I'm just
keep
going. I want to say, just as a moment where I'm leaving, to say thank you to everyone, and especially to Marcela for that last comment. And I actually think it's so relevant, because this politics of listening, and that's not only like in an assembly in a gendered space, this is global, this is so many things, so that we listen first. And that is part of where I think the intervention that at least is being attempted by so many women around the world is that we come in and we really listen and we pause. before we talk, right? You like listen and you let it sit. Your hand doesn't go up while somebody's talking, you know, like that kind of thing. And that's globally too. It was an honor to share space with all of you, and I'm gonna go get my child ready for bed. So
thank you so much, Marina. Thank you so much. And we honor your work as a mom and sharing your time with us. Thank you so much. So Ashley, you were up. I think if you had a comment to make, and it was something about the horror of robots kind of capturing reproductive social work, which I think is just, you know, a very real thing. We see that, you know, the emergence of service culture, you know, and chain space taking up, you know, food production and food emissions. Anybody want to, do you want to speak to that, Ashley?
Sure, I can mention a couple things. So in nursing homes, or particularly in the dementia sphere of care, there's kind of a growing acceptance of using robotic animals to keep people kind of occupied, and like it's very I think problematic for a lot of reasons, but it also can be therapeutic. But it's really I'm not comfortable with it personally, but so there's that issue of, you know, just robotic things that are being used to keep people occupied. I mean, you know, the television, think about, I mean, that's basically it for so many people. But in Japan in particular, they have, you know, robots that can actually, you know, do more, like participation. They have, they're programming devices to be able to respond to people. So say, for example, someone has dementia and they keep repeating a question, there might actually be like an Amazon Echo in the room that can then would say something in response to the person, but they're, you know, they're living in total isolation. And so they actually start to communicate with the device. They're trying to make them kind of have human-like features, but not totally uncanny valley type. And then people start to actually relate to them almost like they're people. And then they sort of, you know, depending on, I mean, it's really like you're playing with people's conscious, you know, like identity recognition of other people, and kind of actually making it more confused in my mind. But yeah, that's all being done right now.
Franz, do you want to respond to that, or Marcela?
I don't have a huge or super profound response, but it just really does speak to the devaluing of this kind of labor and how unimportant it's seen, especially when you're talking about like care for the elderly. Like this is a category of people that, as far as like the capitalist mode of production is concerned, are like past their prime. They're no longer productive. They're no longer workers. And so like there's just like no economic value to the care for these human beings. And it's, I don't know, very dystopian that we would say it's not even worth a human being doing this labor. Yeah, and I mean, and you mentioned like the TV, like so many children now just like have iPads that they're just looking at all the time. And I like do not blame parents who like are like, I have to give my child this iPad to occupy them while I make dinner because I can't do anything else. Like that's not the parents' fault. That's the lack of time and resources being dedicated to like caring for human beings, caring for each other. And it's just, I mean, it's very upsetting. And then like someone mentioned in the chat, do you mention that like similar thing you're talking about is happening with like the education of autistic children, and like that's another category of people that are probably, you know, considered by capitalism to be, you know, less than ideally productive workers. And so, you know, their care and their education is devalued and it matters less. And that's just, I mean, it's horrific, you know, it's anti-human.
Oh my goodness, well said. Marcela, did you want to comment on that at all? Okay, it's pretty freaking dystopian. Toby, you made a comment about kind of women in the nuclear family and social reproductive labor. Did you want to comment or? Are you still here? Isaac had something to say about collective child rearing. Are you still around? Would you like to make a comment about? Okay. Bree, sounds like you would like to make a comment or a question. Not here. It's getting late. It's dinner time, especially for people who are parenting. Harrison, did you have it? You made a really interesting comment earlier on, and you keep saying dystopian. Is there anything you'd like to say about all of this if you're still here?
Oh, nothing that really hasn't been said. But just the anti-human implementation of it's dehumanizing the relationship itself between those people who are institutionalized in that way. That's all. Nothing hasn't been said.
I mean, I'll say one thing, which is that in the 80s and 90s, I was writing a lot about the absorption of the social and private sphere into capitalistic modes of production. And we see this in the service economy, housing and every kind of biological and cultural and social behavior or practice is become commodified and privatized to such an outrageous extreme, because really it's an endless sort of arena for capitalist accumulation. It's literally, culture itself is limitless when it comes to capitalist exploitation. We kind of moved from a Fordist industrial productive system where you have finite sedentary objects, and there's only so many cars or microwaves you can buy, but literally you can't buy enough childcare, elder care, food, housing, prisons. This capital really moved, in the years following World War II, reoriented itself to really capture this social reproductive sphere of life. And this has huge implications for people, for women and people born as women, who are the designated people to be responsible for this kind of work. And it's horrifying when it's literally being dehumanized to the point of having robots caring for your children and older people. I'm just looking to see if there's anybody, or we have 5 more minutes. If there's nobody else who has a comment or question, would either Franz or Marcela like to make some closing comments? And we can. There was a question. Barry Feldman asked, where are the men, accomplices, allies absent? Would you like to make that comment, Barry?
Well, I think you stated my question just fine, Chia.
I can try to respond to it. Well, okay, first of all, real quick, since people are commenting on my poster, I dropped the link to a high quality version of it. We just printed that a few years back, and we're actually selling them as part of a fundraiser to send money to Rojava. So just cool little story. And if you want the poster, just, I don't know, print it yourself. Or print a bunch and sell them for a fundraiser, I don't know. But for Barry's question, like, one of the reasons I really like social reproduction theory is that it focuses on and emphasizes the ways in which, like, women have historically been the ones primarily doing reproductive labor, but it does sort of like universalize this analysis and say that, like, social reproduction is something that needs to happen, is something that does happen, and it's something that should be more universalized. Like, even the first step of recognizing that this is labor that is done and needs to be done, whether it's in the household or in the community or within our political organizations, like, that is something that men should be actively trying to take on more of. And also, in the year 2021, like, in the US, at least the context that I'm familiar with, like, you know, the nuclear family still exists, like single mother household still exists, but there's a lot of room for all different kinds of like family communal organizations, you know, whether they be queer or trans or just, you know, people getting together and raising kids collectively, like, you know, and there's plenty of room for men within child caring. You just have to like step up and do some of the child caring, and lots of men do. You know, there's already, you know, great dads, single dads, whoever dads out there doing that work. So I think as far as like social reproduction goes and doing that kind of work, it's everyone's job, I think, to value that work more, to like step up and do that work if you're someone who isn't already doing that work. So yeah, I mean, I think really like the vision I want to put forward is a universalist vision where, you know, people of all genders, sexualities, races are working together, making democratic decisions together, and having, you know, autonomy over their own lives. So, you know, there's room for everyone.
Thank you. Marcela, would you like to, do you have any comments that you want to kind of close out with?
Yeah, with that, you know, that poster that Franz just shared, PM Press also sells t-shirts with that quote, if anybody's interested on that. And just want to say something to finish. You know, I have traveled a lot in the past to United States, and I lived there for a while. And I have always felt like you're 10 years ahead of us on some issues, you know, like LGBTQ rights and all of that. And, you know, I always feel like in my age, I won't see those changes in my country. But at the same time, you know, I have seen that how history sometimes go in circles, and the things that we have achieved and we have the struggles that we have won sometimes change over time, and there are always the ones that are pushing for our rights to be, you know, taken back. So anyway, just a reflection on that, on how can we maintain what we have won until now. I think it's an important question for all of us, and how we can, you know, support other struggles in other parts of the world that are not as advanced as the things that you have achieved there. I think it's also important, you know, to talk about solidarity and how we can do things better for. Anyway, just want to finish on that, and thanks again for having me here. I'm not really an academic, and I am just trying to talk from my personal experience on these things. So thanks again for your patience.
Thank you both. This was such a rich and wonderful session. So much to think about. I think we're all just I'm sort of speechless. I want to do some announcements about tomorrow. There's going to be a fantastic talk by Phil Kropotkin. It's an introduction to anarchism. He's going to kind of look at the history of anarchism at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then at 1:30, there will be a closing circle. And that's kind of a really nice way to kind of just pull it all together and say goodbyes and thank yous to each other. And people have been sometimes after these sessions getting together in breakouts after the session. I'm not sure Franz knows how to do this. Yes, you do. Okay, cool. So Franz is going to open up this space right now for folks who might want to just keep the conversation going for a little bit longer. But I think we will sign off. Again, I want to thank Franz and Marcela so much for giving us your time and energy. And it's funny because both of you apologized and said, well, I'm not an academic. And this is not actually an academic space. Like, I've been in academia, and the ISC really is not, thankfully, an academic space. It's really a space for people to think and share ideas and experiences. And that's the most, I believe, the most important way that we learn from each other is speaking from our experiences, speaking from theories that we've read, but you don't have to do that in the academy. And in fact, the best work happens, I believe, outside the academy. So I'm so grateful that you brought yourselves here and that we got to benefit from having you here. So thank you both so very, very much. And Great
Thank you
gap.
for facilitating.
Thank you so much. See you all tomorrow at Peter Kropotkin's talk.
Bye.
Yeah.